another BCTR Talks at 12. My name is Debbie Sellers, and I've had the very good fortune to work with Charlie and Elliott over the past 3 years on a variety of projects. So Charlie and Elliott are both researchers here at Veronica Brenner Center, and more specifically with the Residential Child Care Project. So they've been working, along with Michael Nuno and others, well over 5 years now on, probably like 6 or 7, right? On a project funded by the Duke Endowment to evaluate the CARE program, which is a major component of the RCCC project. So they brought their unique interest and skills to this long-term and very collaborative research project. For Charlie, that's an interest and focus on the quality of interactions between those in the helping profession, in this case residential child care staff and their clients, which would be the youth and children in care, and the implementation of complex multi-component interventions in the very messy real-world settings of residential child care facilities. For Elliott, he brings his interest in the well-being and outcomes for maltreated children and his very geeky interest in applying cutting-edge statistical methods and models to evaluate the implementation, again, of complex interventions in very messy settings. So with that, Charlie and Elliott, I'll turn it over to you for your talk, and thank you for your talk.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Debbie. And I guess we decided I'm going to go first because we really shouldn't start the conversation without talking about some data. So that's what I'm going to do. So yeah, so for folks who may not know me, I'm the Elliott of the Elliott and Charlie pair, and today we're going to try to do a lot in a short period of time. So here's what we're hoping happens. So there we go. I'm going to talk briefly just to give you a little bit of context about youth and residential care settings. Just to give you some facts about from national data sources. One of the things that we didn't mention, my other role here in the center is as the Associate Director of the National Data Archive on Child Abuse and Neglect, and so I would be remiss not to use data from our archive to get us started. So we'll do that briefly, then I'll hand it over to Charlie, and he'll give you the picture of the CARE implementation and our sort of roadmap of outcomes and our theory of change. So we'll talk through those things, and then we'll come back and hopefully spend the bulk of the hour talking about findings and sort of some initial sort of 2 big clusters of outcomes that we're interested in that we wanted to tell you about. I'll talk about the use of physical restraint at one agency in Connecticut and the impact of CARE in that setting. Then we'll talk about serious behavioral incidents in this multi-site study in North Carolina. And then in that same group of agencies, we'll also talk about youth's report of the quality of their relationships with the adults and staff that they live with in residential care. So that's kind of the plan for today. And as promised, look, very hard to see, lots of words. So that's my specialty. Since perhaps you can't see it over there, Mandy, I'll zoom through it. So basically, we're talking about youth in residential care. Most are the majority of kids in group settings are kids in the foster care system in the U.S. There are, at the end of the fiscal year in 2014, they represented about 14% of all kids in foster care. That's about 56,000 youth. This population of kids it's a troubled population. They've had a range of adverse childhood events. The one study also from the archive, a little advertisement, has found that kids in foster care have suffered 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, which is associated very highly with negative outcomes later in life. So that's all foster youth. Kids in residential care also have that same adverse history, abuse and neglect, parental separation, exposure to violence, and substance use and mental illness, and of course also parental incarceration. But then when we look specifically at kids in residential care, the data have found that they are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with a DSM classification disorder. They're 6 times more likely to have their own behavior as a contributing factor to their removal from the home. And they also spend, on average, about 28 months in foster care, which is 7 months longer than other kids in foster care. So it's so that's one of the reasons I think that both Charlie and I are so interested and motivated to understand how can we improve the settings and situations for these kids and improve their outcomes. So that's kind of how we got involved with Martha Holden and Michael Nuno. Michael and Martha both are, you know, the geniuses behind the Residential Child Care Project. And RCCP, we call it, is sort of broken up into these 3 areas. You may be familiar with therapeutic crisis intervention. There's also the institutional child abuse training program, and then what we're going to focus on today is care. So they and all of the implementation and training staff involved with RCCP have years and years of experience working in these different settings, and it's been exciting to be a part of the evaluation effort to see how the outcomes are shaping up. RCCP is a global project, a global program. Today we're going to talk a lot about the North Carolina study. We'll also talk about Waterford School in Connecticut. But also CARE really got its start in South Carolina. We call them the pioneer agencies, and that's really where it was developed. And Martha and all of her team spend an outrageous amount of time traveling all over the world, training staff globally. So that's a very quick introduction, and I'll hand it over to Charlie.
You sit here.
Yeah, absolutely.
See folks here. Thanks for coming. Yeah, so I'll be talking about one of those 3 programs, Children and Residential Experiences, and the subtitle is Creating Conditions for Change. I'm just going to scratch the surface. Think about residential child care agencies, the kinds of kids that they serve, and all the dynamics that happen within these agencies, within the children's own lives and families, and within the surrounding community and the government agencies that all interact with the system in one way or another. CARE actually deals with all of that stuff, and it's very complex and it's very intense. CARE is a 3-year intervention. So I'm going to tell you a few things that are going to give you a flavor for what CARE is. Anybody who's interested in this, I really encourage you to, you can buy this book. This is Martha's book. It's really easy read, bestseller, and for the Child Welfare League of America for several years running. And here's a pamphlet if anyone wants to just take one and look through that talks a little bit about CARE. So just talking about the implementation and the model could be a full day discussion or more. But I think of this as kind of the quintessential ecological intervention. So in that it's designed to help people think ecologically and at the same time help them provide some guidance so they can intervene ecologically. and be guided by their understanding of how the circumstances and dynamics surrounding the child influence the child, and how they can be brought to bear to help the healing process as well. So, so here is the thumbnail sketch, providing basically a universal standard for all agency practices from top to bottom, whether you're talking about the food that they're served or how funding gets sought out, reevaluating everything based on the standard, what is in the best interest of the children and the residents who live here. And if anyone is familiar with this area, it's fairly common that lots of other kinds of priorities come into play to determine what are the policies and practices that kind of govern what happens in agencies that have nothing to do with the best interests of children. Not that people don't care, but there's all kinds of things, priorities that people have to juggle, and CARE is about refocusing on the most important thing. So having these discussions and priorities play out in a congruent way across all the levels of the agency. So easier said than done, but just you get the sense of what the holy grail is, to get everyone thinking and acting kind of in a coordinated way, guided by this. So there's a lot of control, there's a lot of tendency for any organization to drift towards greater control and less kind of individualization, because in many ways organizations seem to function better that way. But once people become aware and start thinking of these things regularly, and importantly talking about them regularly, then they can orient where control and compliance are appropriate and where they're not, where they're helping and where they're hurting. So Martha did a pretty comprehensive literature review looking at kind of multidisciplinary review, developmental psychopathology, family studies, child welfare, and she can tell you probably 8 or 10 other different disciplines that she's looked through, neuroscience, to see what are some basic lessons that we can learn from all that literature over a period of probably 20 or 30 years, probably more, that will be helpful for the people who are running these agencies and the people who are directly caring for the children, to provide a guide for them, to provide some rules of thumb, what we call principles, care principles. So all these things could stand lots of discussion, and maybe at the end when we just have a conversation, if you have questions, we can get into any of them, but I'll just rattle through them. The programming for children needs to be developmentally focused, family involved, relationship-based, competence-centered, trauma-informed, and ecologically oriented. So you're probably all familiar with these kind of themes, and they run throughout all the human services, although not as prominently as we'd like them to, but everybody's heard of these things. And one of the things that CARE is trying to do is say, here's your lens. As you're trying to figure out why this kid is acting that way, or how I might intervene with this kid, or how I might work with this family, or even how I might work with these other staff who are stressed out trying to work with these kids, at least one of these things is going to be useful for you to try to, A, understand what's going on with them, and B, figure out how you're going to respond in an effective way. So, is there anything else you'd like to say about that, Martha?
No, you're doing great.
Okay. Vote of confidence. So, Elliott and I came on in 2008 and started thinking about, Michael had unearthed this opportunity to do an evaluation of this program. They had already done a lot of piloting, development, implementation in South Carolina, and it was time to basically say, a lot of people are interested in this, let's evaluate and understand it better before we start disseminating it. Very responsible approach, kind of, I think, one of the themes that we try to maintain at BCTR. So with their help, we just kind of mapped out what are the big fish, what are the big outcomes that you'd expect to see change if CARE was really doing what it was supposed to do based on the design that Martha developed. So quickly, ultimately, we want kids to be better off, we want better social and emotional well-being, we want less fewer behavior problems. To make that happen, the most proximal thing that has to happen, probably one of the most important things that has to happen, is youth need to experience quality interactions with staff. Because one of the things that triggers all this behavior, and if you ever did follow up on what Elliott was talking about therapeutic crisis intervention and how a lot of these behaviors escalate into real violence and restraints and those kinds of things, very often what's triggering it is inadequate interactions with staff. Either staff do things that escalate, or staff fail to do things that kids really need them to be doing. So in order for youth to have quality interactions with staff actually need to get this congruence thing going, get all on the same page about how do I understand what these kids are experiencing and how do I respond appropriately. So we call them shorthand practices that are consistent with care principles. But the thing that drives that is they need to kind of believe these are the kinds of things that are what children need. They have to have some understanding of some basic concepts, some basic facts about child development, about how kids respond to a history of trauma, what kids need at different developmental stages, what they're capable of at different developmental stages, et cetera. So, so some combination of understanding, believing, and being motivated, being inspired, I would say, which we didn't measure inspiration necessarily, although we need to. It's more than understanding, it's inspiration. Because what's really happening here is in order for care to have the effect that we want it to have, to really have an impact on giving kids better experiences, they have to get over quite a hump, to unlearn a lot of habits. Organizationally, the organization needs to unlearn a lot of habits as well and make some changes, and that takes a lot more than just knowing what to do. So the intervention itself, we'll talk about a little bit about some aspects of it, but much of it is providing some initial training and initial support to agencies, and then setting them on their way to use that information and providing support to them along the way. So this line, this kind of region here represents, you can think of it as arms. We provide them with some new resources, and then we guide them. I say we, Martha and the implementation team, guide them over a 3-year period or more to figure out what to do with these new insights that they have. But the leadership team, the local leadership team, is the one that's actually doing the main work, the innovative work at the agency. One thing I'm just going to mention, we're not even going to probably get into it very much, but an important thing that we have done and are really trying to step up our game is database feedback, promoting database decision-making. We want them to reflect on what's happening at the agency, partly based on the principles, but it's potentially very powerful to have a continuous flow of data that lets them know what's happening in all these different areas, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, so they can guide themselves and figure out, are we starting to see movement where we want to see it? Or maybe we're seeing good movement with some kids and not others, or with some staff and not others, and that kind of helps them kind of course correct over time. So in order to make all that stuff happen, in the last slide, there's got to be organizational norms, organizational support, and commitment to support staff to change their practices. So some of the things that influence that are what's valued at this agency, which I'll generally have as a brief definition for the culture at the agency. What are the norms for what's valued and what's expected? And the climate, the working climate. Are people totally so stressed out that they can't think of changing their behavior, taking a risk of not using their normal practices, trying to talk differently with kids? So to kind of make that stuff take root, CARE does some things at the organizational level to help the leadership, and I would say, kind of the top leadership and the management and supervisory structures at that strata of the organization to kind of start developing and implementing specific practices to keep these principles on the radar all the time, keep them in the language, in the discussion process, so that they're ideally, you'd want maybe weekly discussions about these kinds of things. Ideally, you want daily discussions about them, but so that it's always on the radar in supervision, in staff meetings, things like that. And may sound easy, but it's pretty challenging to figure out how to work that into a packed schedule that these folks have, a packed set of priorities. So, so part of the implementation is kind of consultant-led activities, training, trainer of trainers, quarterly consultant visits, but like I say, the lion's share is kind of done day after day by the local implementation team. So that's a thumbnail sketch of the program model. You can unpack more of it if you want later. You can ask for any questions, if there's any questions about the CARE approach that I can answer quickly, and then I'm going to kind of hand things over to Elliott to start talking about the first round of results. Okay. So, starting on the right side of the theory of change, just say every one of these boxes we've kind of done some kind of measurement of. So we're starting with outcomes we've seen in the youth behavior arena.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's kind of the setup, right? And so now let's talk through a few of these main outcomes. Like I say, we're focusing here on youth behavior at first, but we're looking at it maybe from a perspective maybe that's a little unusual. So I'll explain what that means in just a moment. But so first, to start off, we're going to talk about measurement. That gets me excited. So what's an effective measure, right? Oftentimes we're used to survey data, and in our evaluation we're using a lot of survey data. We're talking with youth, we're talking with staff, we're doing instruments and that sort of thing. But these first two examples that I want to share with you, they're really focused on using local administrative data, data from the agency. And I'm hoping to show you that those data are incredibly valuable, even though it may not be apparent exactly how they relate to these different care principles that we've been talking about and that sort of thing. And that's where my picture comes in. I grew up in South Carolina, and I spent a lot of time on Steve Stevenson's dock, reading comic books and fishing. And one of the things we would do there is just sit and watch the bobber for hours, because I'm not a very good fisherman. So we would just watch this bobber and just pray that something would happen under the water that we couldn't see, and make that bobber move. So that's really what these outcomes that I'm getting ready to talk to you about, that's how I see those outcomes. They are the surface. We can't be there. The administrators can't be. None of us are there every moment of the day. We can't see what's happening under the surface of the water. But if good things are happening or negative things are happening, the bobber really should be moving around. And so that's what the power, I think, of these next two outcomes that I'm going to show you. This slide is my attempt to say, if you're leaving today and you're wondering, what do I take with me, other than the cool slide of the bobber picture, these sort of set of suggestions, I think, really come in handy if you work in organizations. It's really valuable to capitalize on existing data collection efforts. people resist, they're busy, like Charlie said, people resist new data collections, new things, adding more to my day, for God's sake. So if we can find what data currently are already part of the culture and part of the policies and procedures, and then ask ourselves, which of those measures are meaningful? Which ones would we expect have some predictive validity for problems at the agency or strengths at the agency? So, so can we identify meaningful measures? You'll find I love alliteration, so that just strap on, because that's the first one, meaningful measures, and then we'll keep going. So then if you have the opportunity to implement, make a change somewhere, implement it, maybe you're at one agency, but if you can implement it and compare multiple settings across that one agency. Or if, like we have in North Carolina, we have the opportunity to implement care in many different places. It really leverages our potential for insight. So that's something to really strive for. Another thing is, okay, we have our meaningful measure. Let's make sure that we're collecting it consistently and at regular intervals over time. And collect it for a long period of time. This makes me think of, I think it was David Levitsky over Nutrition who published recently that the best way to maintain your weight is to get on a scale every morning. And if you have MyFitnessPal, you enter it in so you have data, so for instance. And that's the same sort of idea. If you're measuring something that's important, you're doing it regularly, consistently, and you're doing it over a long period of time, patterns emerge, and important, meaningful patterns emerge. Even though, you know, maybe I did overdo it with that half a piece of pie last night. That's just one data point over a long string.
You ate 2 brownies.
So I did not. So, so then, finally, okay, so all of this sounds great, right? But if all of that's done in an organization where data aren't treated, if it's done in an organization where data are treated as sort of weapons to be wielded, data is used to punish people, that's not an effective, that's not going to be effective. If we can use data as a tool for insight in promoting sort of a growth mindset, giving people an opportunity to see, here's where I am today, how can I reflect and grow and improve tomorrow? If that's the ideal, and I think a lot of the care implementation and the data-led efforts are really focused toward, okay, how can we use data to improve practice, but without, and encouraging people to improve without punishing them if they didn't meet some target meaningless metric. So that's another sort of piece of this. So thank you, Soapbox. Moving on. Let's actually talk about some data. First, I'll tell you about this. Michael and I have been working with Waterford Country School. It's been around for a long time, a 90-year organization. They provide just an array of services. I'm going to tell you about 2 particular settings at Waterford today. But they have residential treatment programs, emergency shelter care. They have day school students that come in, special ed, a variety of different programs. And it's a large organization serving boys and girls 8 to 18 years of age. And so Michael and Martha got to know Bill, the director of Waterford, years ago, and we learned that they had been collecting data for many, many years in a very consistent way. And one of those outcomes they were particularly interested in was the use of physical restraint. So we saw that as an opportunity to sort of test our bobber hypothesis. If care is working, will we see physical strength reduce? Will we see improvements in physical restraint? So physical restraint is a behavioral intervention in a crisis, and it's and it may be necessary sometimes, but at the same time, the use of physical restraint is also associated with environments that may be overly coercive or punishing in some way. And for kids who have survived a great deal of trauma, that can be a particularly problematic technique, or it can have downstream consequences. You might deal with the crisis at the moment, but there can be repercussions later. So it's a really meaningful measure. And also, I think of it, I've never run this by Martha to see if she agrees with me, but I think of a restraint as an interaction that failed, okay? So it should have been, ideally should have been avoided or diverted, diffused. So if we think of it that way, and we can compute and love the equation editor in all office products, so I recommend it highly. That's how I got this. So if we look at the number of restraints and we can divide by the average number of youth each month, let's say is the way we did it, each month, at an agency we can get a restraint rate, and then we can plot that over time. And I apologize if this is too small, but I wanted to show you sort of the existing patterns of restraint rates for the 6 years prior to the initiation of care at Waterford Country School. So there are a few features that I wanted to highlight here. So, and I'll spend a little bit of time just to orient you because you're going to see a lot of these kind of graphs down the road here. On the x-axis, we have months, and months is centered on January 2009. That's the month that care implementation began at Waterford, okay? So, so we have 72 months prior to that, so minus 72 to 0, and then we have 72 months, 6 years after care. It might have already been on the previous slide, I can't remember. It took about 18 months oh no, it's coming up. I stole the show. So yeah, it took 18 months to train up all the staff at Waterford. So so that's how you look at the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we've got restraint rates. This is a per capita rate. So this would be the number of restraints in a month per child, per youth there. Okay. And you can see over that 6-year period, I put a low F curve through there. That's the red line. Just to see what does it really look like. And you can see there's a lot of variability. There are good years and bad years, good months and bad months, right? So this is in residential treatment, the residential treatment program at Waterford. So those are those 6 years. Now here's the emergency shelter program. Same graph. We see lower restraint rates. We see less variability, and things are pretty stable over that 6-year period, right? So, so aren't you excited? This is giddy. I'm giddy. So, okay. So this is here's what they already had in place at Waterford. They had been collecting these, putting these in their annual reports, and so then they implement care. Like I said, January of 2009. We actually have data, and in the publication we'll have 3 programs, but today I wanted to focus on 2 because it's a simpler story. And I would be remiss in not telling you about the wonderful ways you can analyze these data. The one way using visual analysis doesn't require a lot of statistical expertise. It's using your eyeballs, and I'll show you. We're going to be looking for changes in level, changes in trend, and changes in variability. And if we can see those things happen in the period after relative to the period before, then we can feel some measure of confidence that we've found an effect. Then if you aren't happy with just looking at the picture and you really want to impress people and say generalized linear mixed models, then that's what this section is. And I won't go into it, but there's a wonderful researcher, William Shadish, who's really publishing some neat stuff right now on how to implement these kinds of things in interrupted time series design. So that's really where we're pulling our inspiration. So now here's the fun part. This was the period that we saw before. Using the fancy pants statistical model, here is our measure of level and trend, and also that gray area is our measure of variability in the 6 years prior. So even though it was bouncing around, you see that on average it sort of cancels out. Then in the 6 years after CARE, the data went like this. So we saw perhaps a reduction in, we definitely saw a reduction in variability, but we also, and the way I've set the model up, it all is anchored right here on that point at the start of CARE. So then we start to redraw the line at that point. And so you really can start to measure the rate of improvement. And you see one thing that makes CARE tricky is that it's a long-term implementation. So you wouldn't expect to see results immediately. So we see a gradual improvement over time. And so that was in the residential setting. And then when we moved to the emergency shelter, and I've zoomed in a little bit on the scale here, so same thing, we have flat, lots of variability, and then in the period after, the variability dropped dramatically, and then we saw improvements, even to the point of where, there's not much room for improvement. So that's the story of Waterford, and the way that we're interpreting these results as a meaningful way of describing sort of a global impact that CARE has had. And now I honestly can't remember what my next slide is.
Jump right in.
Jump right in. Yeah. So there we go. So Charlie's like, come on. So that's Waterford. Now let's switch gears. Well, one thing I'll say about Waterford, the thing that's exciting about that for me is that we do have 12 years of data. That's an unusual thing. You might say, oh, it's only one agency, but it's 12 years of data, and we have multiple settings. Now we move to North Carolina, where we implemented residential child care project, people who actually have social skills, they implemented in 11 agencies. They did 5 agencies starting in 2010. We call that the first cohort. And then we had a second cohort of agencies in 2011 that started. So we had a 1-year gap. And then just so that you can see, these are pretty small residential group homes. They typically had about 13 residential staff who lived there sort of 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. That's better than when I did it after college. And then usually there are about 24 kids at an agency, in these agencies where we work. This time, though, we switched our measure. Many agencies that we were working with, I think this is correct, they weren't using physical restraint, fortunately. So we used a measure of serious behavioral incidents. They were at these group home settings, you are required to record and note incidents that occur. We went in and zoomed in on those incidents, these 5 particular types of incidents that we thought were particularly relevant for the CARE intervention. So expressions of aggression toward staff or toward other youth, self-injurious behavior, property destruction, and running away. And then again, given my love of the equation editor, I had to show you how to do the rate again. So now we're doing incident rates, not just physical restraint. Okay? Here's basically what it looks like. We did 5 outcomes. I'm going to show you the 3 outcomes that were consistent across both cohorts. We had some cohort differences on the other 2 outcomes, and it's too complicated, and I'm already running out of time. So I didn't put that in. But these curves represent what we call the fixed effects, the average over those agencies, after controlling for site-to-site variability differences. Some agencies have a lot of incidents, some agencies have not as many. So we've sort of adjusted for all of that within our statistical model, and then these curves represent sort of the effect over top of individual variation. So interestingly, we actually saw in the 12 months prior to care starting that things actually were trending up on many of our outcomes. But then over the course of the 3-year intervention, we were able to change the slope of that curve, and we saw improvements in aggression towards staff, property destruction, and in runaway. Runaway is more like what I had expected to see, more flatness in the 12 months and then steady improvement. But the analytic approach sort of showed it across the board like this. Now, so this is showing you the trends over time. There's also a test of program effect. So what's the difference between the implementation period and the baseline period? And so here's a graph that represents that. We showed about 9 or 10% increases each month in, say, aggression towards staff, for instance, prior to care, and then in the periods after care, the rates tended to improve at about 4 to 5% each month over the course of the 3 years. So, and a similar pattern with property destruction and runaway. Okay? So yeah, Lord have mercy, that was fast. So those are basically the results I have to share related to this, and now we'll pivot over and talk about use perception of this as well. So, thanks. Ooh, sorry.
Nice job. Quick comment on evaluation. What you're really trying to do, for those of you who may not have much of a science background, is you got to show that any improvement you might see is better than what would have happened if you didn't do anything. This period represents what would have happened if you didn't do anything. Fancy word is counterfactual. So we're comparing this with this. There's a million different ways to establish what would have happened if you didn't do anything. Randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard. You get a whole set of identical agencies that you didn't give the program to. Anybody finds a set of two identical agencies in the world, I'll pay you a lot of money. So this is what we do. This is the interrupted time series approach you were saying is what we do when we can't reasonably do a randomized controlled trial. So just working our way back through, we could continue this another hour and talk to you about some of the other outcomes here, some of which were positive and some of which were not, some of which showed program effect and some of which didn't. But overall, the pattern of finding supports the idea that not only are we showing improvements in these behavioral outcomes, but we're showing it seems to be happening in the way we think it is, okay? So since we couldn't do 2 separate agencies randomly assigned, we did what they often do in medical trials, is a waitlist design. So this is the same group of agencies, but it's analyzed a little bit differently. So we had one group of agencies that got the program in the first year, while the second set of agencies just did the assessments, but didn't really start the program until the second year. So we have a 1-year lag. So we're always hoping to see better improvement relative to cohort 2, better improvement in cohort 1 relative to cohort 2. This period, this difference of a year, is our counterfactual, okay? So developed a survey with a lot of input from young people in care and some agency staff as well to try to figure out what should we be asking kids about. There's an established instrument for adolescents looking at attachment, so we use that, And then we also developed a lot of questions that are more specific, that kind of cast a little broader net of the kinds of things that we thought CARE would actually have an influence on. So, just some examples. I trust that. How do you feel about, how do staff interact with you, or how do you feel about your relationships with staff? I can get into some details if anybody wants to see sometime, or you can contact me afterwards. They understand me, they accept me as I am, I can count on them. So, basically, what we've done is superimposed the incident findings with the changes in kids' ratings of their relationships with staff. So, over time, and this is cohort 1, you see, here's the 12-month pre-CARE, here's when CARE started. At about 1 year, you saw the more precipitous decline in, can all those people over here see precipitous decline in incidents? Right around the same time is when you start to see kids giving higher ratings of their relationships with staff. Do we see the same thing in cohort 2? This is the value of having this other way to kind of cut up the data, because we want to do a more conservative test. We don't want to be super quick to say, hooray, we got a finding that's in the direction we expected, let's go to the press and say, let's disseminate this throughout all the states in the country. We got to be conservative. We've got to test ourselves. Let's do this other agency. Do we also see that? You see something similar, not exactly the same. You see actually in cohort 2, a less extreme decline in cohort 2 in the rate of incidence, but an earlier increase in the kids' improvements in their ratings of their relationships with staff. So we're doing a whole paper on this. There's a lot to say about it. I was just giving you a snippet so you get a sense of what we're finding. There's all kinds of interesting results on when you look at, well, what about when you look at the kids who've been bounced around in a lot of different placements, the highest risk kids versus the kids where maybe this is their first placement, younger versus older. You start seeing some different patterns, and so far they've been kind of in the direction that we'd expect, you know. So we'll, all that's going to get unpacked in a paper. But so what we're trying to do basically is take what we're finding now, obviously get some initial papers out to make sure that people know about these kind of later stage outcomes, but now working on some of these other outcomes and other processes, which we have data on all this stuff, some quantitative, some qualitative, to see is it all starting to line up the way we'd expect. So we're going to be looking at other outcomes that are shown in the theory of change. Are there changes in the climate and culture that you would see? Are the changes we see in these outcomes dependent on what the climate and culture was at the organizations at the beginning? Trying to find out better ways of getting better quality data. We have pretty good quality data as things go in this field, but a person who does a lot of lab research would say, well, there's some things you could do to kind of tighten up your assessments, reduce your error. So I won't get into the details on that. But we're actively working on that stuff within the data we have, and as well as writing grants to try to get funding to kind of go a little deeper into what's happening in the agencies. I'm going to stop there just because I want to have people have time to ask some questions. So that is basically your thumbnail sketch of the CARE program and our initial results as we see them today. Does people have questions on either the program or the results? Diane?
I have a question. Just I'm looking at your last point on your slide there. Did any of the programs you already evaluate use DBT or TFCBT or any of those interventions?
Yeah. And you know, one of the ways that kind of metaphors that we've used for CARE vis-a-vis these other kinds of interventions is you think of it as kind of your computer's operating system. You can put all kinds of programs in there, and we would expect that CARE would enrich and enhance the capacity of those programs to really do what they need to do. Because a lot of the things that limit practitioners' ability to use those things effectively is that there's all this other stuff going on that works counter to, you know, establishing the trusting relationship they need to establish with the family to work with them for a 2-year period or whatever. So, and all the staff level dynamics that make it hard for people to kind of stay at an agency long enough to get great at doing DBT, you know. So, questions?
Does everybody know what DBT is?
Oh, dialectical behavioral therapy is, Diane can tell a lot more than I can about it, but it was designed originally, I think, for treating a borderline personality disorder and people with a lot of emotion regulation problems, but it's actually since been expanded to other populations as well.
I thought it was don't buy tomatoes.
Well, don't buy tomatoes unless they're organic. So I'm going to say this, and maybe it'll stimulate some thoughts. Part of the story we have is here's the program approach and here's the results we found. Another part of the story, if you kind of take a more wide-angle view, is look across human services. Evidence-based therapies, evidence-based programs are proliferating, and there's a value set that kind of is the foundation for that, which is that we can, this is a bit of an overstatement, but not too much, we can find technologies, techniques for helping people either prevent mental health problems or treat mental health problems or social problems. And once we find out that they can be implemented and show some results, we can basically disseminate them. There's some steps we have to take. We have to see, are they going to work with this population or that population? Once you do 6 or 7 studies, you can basically manualize this thing and disseminate it. And that has been the zeitgeist, I would say, up until about 5 to 10 years ago, maybe just 5 years ago. People are really starting to question that assumption. CARES kind of takes a different approach. There are some things that are manualized. There's those kind of consultant-led activities. But the real work is being driven locally so that people have an investment in it. They're basically not doing your program. They're doing their program. They've been inspired by you, educated by you, and they kind of are guided by rules of thumb, principles, rather than following a step in a curriculum. A couple of things that's great about that is, one, you get the motivation and the enthusiasm and the ownership, but you also get a greater capacity, I would say a greater expectation that they're going to individualize how this plays out with each kid and family that they work with. So it's a different model. Yes?
From the data guide here, questions on both of the graphs you showed popped into my head. In the North Carolina study, it seemed like an acceleration of bad stuff just before your program started, and then an abrupt change.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, in the Connecticut study, you also had an abrupt change as the program came in. And I just wondered if the program coming in somehow influenced the way data was being collected.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
Put him in the audience.
Yeah. So,
Thank you for asking.
Yeah, no, actually, one of the strengths of these particular outcomes that we used in both places were that they were sort of an established part of the culture. They also have sort of legal requirements that are mandated through certification to have to file an incident report when a certain thing happens. So it doesn't have the latitude to where someone could choose whether or not a report gets filed, that kind of thing. So the care and also too the care intervention never specifically talks about these outcomes. These aren't really a focus of the of the care training.
Well, they don't talk about the reporting of those.
That's what I mean. I'm thinking about the incidents in particular.
The interpersonal dynamics,
Yeah,
but not.
so that what
Right.
pops in my head then, if we could assume the data collection is consistent
Mm-hmm.
in the two aspects of both charts,
Uh-huh.
that just the awareness in the organization that there's something coming in has
I
a
see.
real impact on outcomes, even though it's not totally obvious.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was hearing a different thing. So, yes, that certainly can be the case. I mean, we wondered about that specifically with that increasing trend in North Carolina. One analysis that I did was I went in and went into particular measures and found agencies that showed no time trends at all. But in each particular outcome, it was usually about 9 out of the 11 agencies that didn't show any sort of pre-care time trends. And so I analyzed just that group to ask, is there a program effect? And we still get the program effect. So the increased rate wasn't really driving the improvement, and also it wasn't very common. It was only usually 2 out of the 11 agencies where we would see sort of an increase on an outcome. So I don't know. I didn't for me support very strongly the idea that like maybe people were feeling anxious about the beginning of, or, yeah, right, no, exactly. No, that was exactly what we were interested in.
So just want to give a quick follow-up. Martha always says, if it was that easy to get people to have fewer conflictual interactions, then all we really need to do is say, hey, there's a program coming in. And yet, what you're saying is very important, and I think it really needs to be considered. When an organization gears itself up to do a major intervention like this, to make a commitment like this, it does send a signal to the agency. And so much the better if they start the discussion and the energy that needs to be started to get people to think twice before they slap a restraint on someone or get back in the kid's face to keep escalations going. There may have been those kind of discussions. I imagine there were some of those discussions. I imagine supervisors might have been privy to part of those discussions. The nice thing is, if what happened is people that just heated up very well, so people are saying, we got to change. We want to change. How do we do this? In comes the care team to give them a whole bunch of new stuff to get started with it. So I think this is why what I was saying is we need a lot more precise data collection about what's happening on the ground. It'd be nice to be there for the 2 months before care starts to see what's happening, what's changing, what conversations are there. I'm sorry, do a question.
Has there been any data collective evidence showing that once the kids graduate from the program, which I presume they're emancipated at 18 or something, that's traditionally been a really tough transition.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, are the kids coming out in better shape?
Right. So we haven't done that because we're in an early stage of our program of research, and that's something we need to be doing is following people up, which is, you can imagine, this population. They may only stay at the agency for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, but then they may be gone. Some of them stay for longer. So it's a major task to select people that are representative of all the kids that are coming through. So if you only pick the 20% of kids that graduate and actually go on to go home or something like that, then it's a limited sample. However, there are some studies of similar kinds of models. They take a different approach. They're a little more behavioral than care is, a lot more behavioral than care is, but that have found some positive results after longer-term follow-up. So it was all we could do to be able to see the kids during the period of time during the implementation and maybe a year after. So, but that is really what needs to be done. You're right.
Absolutely.
John.
Sorry, I missed this. How long is the care team on site? How long is the intervention?
3 years. But as our folks will tell you, once you invite them in,
We never leave.
they never leave.
And
they're quarterly.
If when you show up, there's an effect just by showing up. If you leave, there's an effect when you leave.
Right.
If you're always there, you don't know what happens.
Yeah. No, that's a good point.
Well, we'll be able to do that because we're doing the annual follow-up.
Right. So, but the problem, it's not really a problem, is that I think almost all the North Carolina agencies signed on for additional 3 years of support because they want to keep it going. They value it that much. But at some point, they'll be on their own.
No, they won't.
I don't mean on their own, bad choices. They'll be providing support to each other and just checking in to tell us how great they're doing it. But
Well, it's just an annual kind of data collection, and there's after the implementation, so it's a whole different intervention.
Yeah.
Not much.
Okay. But, so we are past time. Well, Elliott and I will stick around and answer questions if anybody has any more, but I really appreciate you coming. Thank you.